Today we are going to take a look at the Haute M16 Plus, an entry-level leverless controller made in China with a nice aluminium case and a total of 16 buttons for you to use. If you are in any way interested in fighting games and fighting game controllers, you've probably heard of Haute. They are a Chinese brand who make a lot of leverless controllers that a lot of players choose as their first device to figure out if playing on a leverless controller is for them or not. One of the reasons for that is that they are relatively cheap and you can find some of their controllers for like 50 bucks on AliExpress. This one here, the M16 Plus, on the other hand, is their flagship device. But at a price point of around 140 bucks, still pretty cheap. Leverless controllers can get extremely expensive. And if this is not the first review you're watching about the controller, you might have seen a few reviewers calling it the Razer Kitsune Killer. In a sense, I agree, simply because the M16 is way cheaper, but the M16 also has one pretty substantial problem that will make you have to upgrade your controller to a different one if you take especially your Street Fighter 6 game more seriously. Let me give you a short overview of the case. Like I said before, the case is made from aluminium, and when I took it out of the box, I was actually really surprised because this controller feels really premium. The surface feels really smooth and it has a nice weight to it. It definitely does not feel cheap, though the surface is unfortunately a fingerprint magnet, as you can see here. The controller is about 30 cm in length, 20 cm in width, and about 1.5 cm in height, including the buttons. The back regrettably only has these 4 rubber feet to keep it secure. A nice foam layer would have been preferable, especially if you want to use it on your lap. The size of the controller is, in my opinion, definitely big enough to do that comfortably. It is also not easy to open because there are extra screws under the rubber feet. And they use these star screws I do not have a driver for, so can't open it, sorry. Probably one of the reasons a lot of people compare it with the Kitsune is that it also has the LED lights on the side. But differently from the Kitsune, this one's buttons also light up. And if you want, you can also change the effects of the RGB and stuff. You also have a small screen here at the top that can show you button inputs and infos regarding the SOCD and input modes you are using. As you can see right now, I'm using Zinput with SOCD neutral and the D-pad as movement buttons. And you can change all these without needing to go into the firmware. It is all done with button press combinations you can find in the manual. While I mentioned the firmware, this controller uses the GP2040 firmware, which is tried and proved and used by a lot of levelers makers nowadays. Though it doesn't have the compatibility like a Brook Universal Fighting Board out of the box, unfortunately. A controller powered by a GP2040 generally is compatible with PC, PlayStation 3 and Nintendo Switch. If you want to use it on a PlayStation 4 for more than 8 minutes, you will have to upload a DualSense controller key to the firmware. For the current generation PlayStation and Xbox consoles, you'll need what is called a pass-through device. Brook, for example, makes these, and you plug it into the USB port here next to the USB-C. Unfortunately, I'm a pure PC player and don't have a Brook adapter and console lying around to demonstrate this. When it comes to input lag, I also cannot test it in any scientific manner. I can only give you my subjective feeling that I do not notice any input lag. The controller feels really responsive. Let's have a look at the buttons and the layout. In this section, the problem I mentioned in the beginning of the review will come into play. We have 16 buttons that have a diameter of about 35 mm. They are very smooth and low enough so you can do slide inputs quite comfortably, like I'm trying to show you here right now. The switches are Kild Shock V2 low profile switches and hot swappable. This is how the buttons sound. They don't sound particularly special to me, not that thocky, and they seem to rattle a bit. I'm not the biggest fan of the sound, to be honest, but they are alright. The layout is kind of the standard layout for leverless controllers that have more buttons than the standard hitbox layout. We have a WASD, 2 extra thumb buttons and this weird button here. Personally, I do not need this many extra buttons, I only want this thumb button here. Which brings me to another personal negative point regarding the layout. Take a look at my hand placement. My right thumb button is resting between the jump button and this button here. This is my Street Fighter 6 Drive Rush button. I don't like this. I prefer a button layout where this button is lowered or even right next to the jump button, like on this Alpemeister controller, for example. It makes my reactions faster if I don't also have to use my thumb button in a direction to hit the button. But this is purely a preference of mine and not necessarily a negative. Some players don't even use the extra buttons, but I still think it's something worth mentioning. Another thing I want to mention is the WASD layout here. Because the buttons are pretty big, this WASD is actually pretty spread out. If you have smaller hands like mine, it is so uncomfortable to use, bordering on unusable. So if you were maybe planning on using the leverless layout for 2D fighters and the WSD for 3D fighters like Tekken, please keep this in mind. I don't think the WSD on the Haute M16 Plus is particularly good. The main leverless layout is pretty comfortable though, and even after longer play sessions I didn't fatigue because of weird spacing between the buttons or anything. Let's talk about an unfortunate problem regarding the buttons. If I hit these buttons here, the ones down also light up. If I press this one lights up. If I press this one lights up. If I press this one lights up. Why is that? Haute, unfortunately, did not put every button on its own pin. Meaning if you put, for example, L3 here, it will also be present on this button here. This is a problem, because according to the official Capcom rules, you are only allowed to have 11 action buttons beside the direction buttons. So in theory, if you wanted to take this controller to an official Capcom tournament or just an offline event where they take the rules seriously, you'd have to physically remove these buttons. This is a huge design flaw because enough pins exist and are free, so potentially every button could have its own pin. Of course, if you don't go to tourneys, this is not an issue. But still, it needs to be mentioned, and I hope Haute will not repeat this design flaw in future controllers. In conclusion, I think the Haute M16 Plus is a nice entry-level controller in the lower end of the price spectrum. If you just want to give leverless a try and want something a bit bigger you can also comfortably use on your lap, the M16 Plus is not a bad investment. If you're still watching, thank you very much. Please leave a comment, like and subscribe. Any kind of engagement helps with the algorithm. See you next time. Bye bye.